Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 33rd Annual Chicago Tribune Printers Row Lit Fest. My name is Tom Pascalis, and I'd like to thank all of the festival sponsors. Today's program is being broadcast live on C-SPAN 2's Book TV. We're going to have some time at the end for audience questions, so when the time comes, please line up at the microphone to your right, and then the home viewing audience will be able to hear. As always, make sure to silence your cell phones and turn off your camera flashes at this point in time. And with that, please welcome Darlene Glatton, columnist for the Chicago Tribune.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. I am so excited to be here today with Ibram X. Kendi, whose book, Stamped from the Beginning, A Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, is probably one of the most timely books that are out there right now. And we certainly can learn a lot from what Ibram has to talk about today. So Ibram is the recipient of the National Book Award. They praised him in presenting that award as a masterful voyage through the history of U.S. rhetoric. So Ibram is professor of history at the University of Florida, also a finalist for the Book Critics Circle Award. And I just learned today that while in undergraduate school, Ibram was interested in being a journalist, working for a newspaper. We certainly could have used him in that profession, but I'm sure that he has been able to get a lot more accomplished by writing his books. So we're going to start now and just kind of talk a little bit about the book. So, Ibram, as a journalist, I am always curious when someone publishes something so compelling, a thoroughly researched piece, piece of work that you've done here. Did you set out to write a 600-page piece of nonfiction? And how long did it take you to complete this book?
So, first of all, it's a pleasure to sit here with you and be in conversation with you and to be here in Chicago for this festival. And first, I'll answer the second question first. So it took me about 3 years, but it was 3 long years of working from the time the sun was down to the time the sun was still down. And I did not actually set out to write a narrative history of racist ideas that literally covers the entire course of anti-Black racist ideas. I actually set out to initially write a history of scientific racism up to the 1960s. And then it expanded to, let's write a history of scientific racism up to the present. And then that expanded to, let's write a history of racist ideas in general. Which is ultimately what I ended up doing. And as many of you would imagine, there's been quite a few racist ideas in history. And so I actually had to cut down a lot in order to make it, as you would imagine. So
during that time that you were writing, as you point out in your book, there were, as you call them, heartbreaking events that took place in our country that helped to kind of create kind of a Black empowerment movement, particularly among young people. It was a time of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, and others. So how did those events actually influence your writing?
Well, I think when you are writing about anti-Black racist ideas and you're seeing on cell phone videos, on television screens, through the cries of mothers and fathers, just how lethal anti-black racist ideas still are. I think it sort of inspires you, and it really sort of encouraged and showed me just how important this project that I was undertaking. And I think that's really, I think, what guided me sort of along the way. Like, I could not sit here and talk about how difficult it is to compose this history of racist ideas when I saw these families having to deal with the difficulties of police violence.
And certainly, these are issues that we continue to grapple with here. And so what I like about your book is that it lays out the history of these racist ideas in America in a great narrative, and gives us a roadmap of how we can kind of move forward using what we have learned from your research. But another thing, and perhaps more important, is that you have challenged us to look at ourselves and to understand that it's not just white people, but African Americans who can also have racist ideas, and that perhaps we are part of the problem rather than the solution. So some would argue, though, that African Americans can't be racist, that racism involves power over a segment of the population that has impact economically, politically, socially. What do you say to that? Is there a difference between racism and racist ideas?
So I think the easiest way to understand and to really answer this is for us to distinguish between a racist policy and a racist idea. So I defined a racist idea as any idea suggesting that a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. And a racist policy, I more or less define as any policy that yields an unequal outcome between racial groups. So any policy that produces racial inequality. And so I think as it relates to power, you clearly have to have power in order to create or even defend or even execute a discriminatory policy against a group of people. And so certainly it is the case that, let's say, white people have far and away more power in this country to execute those types of policies. But to say that black people do not have any power, which is typically the argument of those who say black people can't be racist because black people don't have power, is to simultaneously say that white people are all powerful. And to say that white people are all powerful is to express one of the oldest racist ideas in history, which is that white people are like gods. And so I don't think, despite many people making the case that white people are gods and they're all powerful, that is the case. And I also think, and I also showed and stamped from the beginning, that black people can say black people are lazy, right? And I think we should also recognize the function of racist ideas. And I think that's one of the, I hope, contributions of Stamped from the beginning. The way racist ideas function and operate in our society is it causes people, when they see racial disparities, it causes them to blame black people for those racial disparities as opposed to racial discrimination. And so then the next step becomes to either civilize or incarcerate black people. And black people are part of that project too, as opposed to doing what? Challenging racial discrimination. And so fundamentally, that's what racist ideas do. It suppresses the resistance to racial discrimination, including within the black community.
That's interesting. You know, one of the other things that I find interesting in what you write is, it made me think about what we do a lot of time as journalists and as in the newspaper industry. we publish, everybody knows that in Chicago we've had our share of problems here with violence and so forth. And we have daily tolls of the murder victims that get probably more clicks than anything on our webpage, as people like to read that. So do those kinds of things actually contribute to a feeling that perhaps African Americans are a violent people overall? Does that, I mean, in any way shape the way people view African Americans?
I think for some people it does. I think that one of the most dangerous racist ideas in this country is the idea of the dangerous black person, is the idea of the dangerous black community. And I think we see how dangerous this idea is in the way it operates in the minds of police officers who, when they see these so-called dangerous people or they enter into these dangerous communities, their trigger finger is a lot closer than when they're in other communities. And so I think this idea is based on a series of misleading statistics, or it's based on ideas that only, when we think about the most dangerous neighborhoods, we only think about things like homicide. So we don't think about other things like, let's say, drunk driving, to give an example. And some years, more people die from drunk driving than they do homicides. And so we have studies that sometimes show that white men are more likely to drink and drive and kill people than other racial groups. But those communities with those high levels of drunk drivers are not considered to be dangerous, right? Because of our sort of flippant connection between danger and blackness. And I think we should reimagine, and I think, you know, what neighborhoods are truly the most dangerous by actually bringing in many different factors. I don't think we should just reduce it to those communities that have the most homicide. And lastly, I'll say that studies show that there's a direct correlation between violent crime rates and unemployment levels, which means that it's actually better for us to understand certain communities as dangerous unemployed communities as opposed to dangerous black communities. But then that would cause a different solution to the problem, right? The solution would not be, let's throw more cops in that community, let's civilize these people. The solution, of course, would be very simple: jobs.
And so what it boils down to really is racial inequality.
Yes.
And what that means for all of us. So in your book, you talk about three sides of the argument surrounding racial inequality. And you say that those are not new ideas, that those are ideas that have been around at every point in every century.
Yes.
So tell us about the segregationists, the anti-racists, and the assimilationists.
Sure. So again, stamped from the beginning, I mean, one of the sort of ways we can understand this title is that racial inequality has been stamped from the beginning of this country. And therefore, Americans have been debating, or I should say arguing, about why we have so much racial inequality. And there's been three positions. The segregationist position has stated that it's because black people are inferior. So to give an example, if over the last 50 years, the black unemployment rate has been twice as high as the white unemployment rate, consistently. So what segregationists will say is that it's because black workers are lazy. Black workers don't want to work. They want to hang out on welfare. They're not qualified. They'll principally blame black workers or black inferiority. Then on the other side of the debate is the anti-racist position. And anti-racists typically view the racial groups as equal. They view black workers as equal to white workers. So for them, it can't be something wrong with black workers. It must be the result of job discrimination. And so they point to job discrimination as the cause of racial inequality. And then the third position, which is a little bit more tricky, is the assimilationist position. And typically, assimilationists say it's actually both. So yes, it is the case that black workers are lazy, but it's also the case that there's job discrimination. Assimilationists will say, well, one of the reasons why they're so lazy is because they've been subjected to so much job discrimination, right? And so what we need to do is not only challenge racial discrimination, but we will also need to civilize black workers.
So we're among friends here. So give me some examples of people who we might know who you think fit into those categories.
Okay, so let's see, the segregationist position, I mean, weeks after Barack Obama was elected president, John McWhorter wrote a piece in Forbes magazine stating that we are now living in a post-racial society, which basically means that racism or racial discrimination is over, which means that any racial disparities and inequalities that still exist must be the result of black inferiority. And so I think that that's one obvious example of a segregationist position. I think that as it relates to an anti-racist position, Black Lives Matter activists, when they've looked out at the problem of race and policing, they have principally stated that, you know what? Yes, we know it's the case that in 2016, young black men were 9 times more likely to be killed by police than other racial groups. Since young black men are equal to these other groups, it must be the result of racial discrimination. It must be the result of discrimination from police, from the criminal justice system more broadly. But then they were not only challenged by the segregationist Blue Lives Matter crowd, but they were also challenged by the All Lives Matter crowd. The crowd simultaneously saying that, yes, there is a problem with race and policing, but there's also a problem with these thugs. There's also a problem with black-on-black crime. And we need to, basically solve both problems.
So, what's the problem with that?
What's the problem with what?
What is the problem with maybe saying that it's the combination of factors, that it's not just, the fact that we should focus on just black on black crime, that we should, that we should not just focus on police brutality, but also black on black crime. What is the issue with that?
So I think typically the argument for black on black crime is typically states that there's a fundamental problem with black people killing black people that is not occurring in other neighborhoods. So there's actually something worse happening in black neighborhoods as it relates to crime. And so it ultimately sort of connotes this idea of black criminality, not criminality, but black criminality being an American problem that black people or Americans sort of need to deal with. And again, when we look at, the statistics, again, you have the policing community that'll say, well, it's because black people commit more crimes. And so that's why we purportedly have a greater black crime problem. But they make those cases based on arrest and incarceration rates. That's crime statistic, arrest and incarceration rates. Even though we have people every day in this country who are committing crimes and what? Not being arrested. We have people who are being arrested and not going to prison. But people assume that if a neighborhood has higher levels of arrest and incarceration, that they have higher levels of crime. And they've been assuming that for a very long time to justify the number of police in black neighborhoods, which ultimately leads to more what? Arrest, and ultimately leads more incarceration. I should say also that a very seductive idea is the idea that slavery literally harmed black people as a group. That segregation literally made black people into brutes. That poverty is literally impoverishing the values of the black community. These are very seductive ideas that is very prominent within assimilationist thought, and I once believed them wholeheartedly myself. But when I started looking for evidence that actually proves these ideas, it came up lacking.
That's interesting. You know, one of the things that we know from polls and surveys of various types is that African Americans and white people in general look at race through a different lens.
Yes.
And, you know, we just don't see things eye to eye. So there's often this talk about a conversation about race, that the country needs a conversation about race. What would that look like?
Well, I think the first and most important thing that would be important for that type of conversation, I think this is the very reason I wrote this book, was for us as a nation to sit down and finally agree on a definition for a racist idea. And the reason why that's so important, you know, I ended up, again, defining a racist idea as any idea suggesting that a racial group is superior or inferior to another racial group in any way. The reason why that's so important is because people have conversations regularly about race, but then they refuse to admit that their ideas about black people or even other group of people are racist. So people want to speak, and people want to denigrate, and people want to imagine these racial hierarchies, but they don't want to be considered racist. And so that creates this conundrum. People also do not want to accept the facts, right? And so, you know, you present people with facts that dispute their ideas about black people, but they still want to believe what they want to believe. And it makes sense, because the other alternative is that racial discrimination is pervasive. And people do not want to believe that. People are so, I mean, they love this idea of a post-racial America. I mean, they're hugging it so tightly, and they refuse to look at the facts that say otherwise.
Well, anybody who still thinks that we live in a post-racial society, I don't know what to say. But you're right, though. I mean, because we do hear a lot of that.
And if I could add one quick thing.
Sure.
I think another thing we should do as a nation is the way I led off this book, is by admitting my own racist ideas. So I admitted that I had consumed a series of racist ideas about black people over the course of my lifetime, living in this country. And I think we have to enter these discussions admitting ourselves. How are we going to become better people? How are we going to become a better nation if we're not willing to admit it? It makes sense. I mean, you have racist ideas swirling around you. It makes sense that you're going to consume a few of them.
Can you share with us something that you realized about yourself?
Sure. I mean, I of course, as a black male, having negative experiences with a black woman, I would generalize that to say black women are like this in a negative sense, which is a racist idea. I should be saying that that particular individual was like that. I used to think that black neighborhoods were more dangerous than white neighborhoods until I realized that that was based on a series of misleading statistics. I used to believe that black children were intellectually inferior to white children, or that's not what's said, that black children are achieving at a lower level than white children, when I realized that those ideas were based on standardized tests that were created by eugenicists. And so and I can sort of go on and on. I had all these ways of explaining racial disparities that denigrated black people that I didn't realize were actually not based on facts.
So in order to do that, does it have to be a conscious decision that you want to examine how you feel about race?
Yes.
And decide that you're going to do something about it?
Yes, and I think it has to be a conscious decision to want to become an anti-racist. And so we like to think of and imagine that there are racist and non-racist. There's no such thing as a non-racist, right? Either you believe in racial hierarchy, that certain racial groups are superior in certain ways than others, or you believe in racial equality. And when you say racial equality, I should say, when you say groups are equal, you're not stating that the people are the same, right? You can have two equal teams that have totally different offensives and defenses, but they're still equal. And you're also not stating that everybody in both groups are great, right? What actually makes black people equal to white people and other groups is not the Barack Obamas of the world, is not the Oprahs of the world. It's actually the imperfections of black people that makes them equal because it makes them human, right? Any group of people in this country, in this world, has a series of, it's basically a collection of imperfect individuals, right? But what happens is black negativity is generalized while white negativity is individualized. And so black people are not able to basically be imperfect, right? When they're surrounded by these racist ideas. And so I think, us striving to be anti-racist, us asking questions like, okay, since the racial groups are equal, what is actually causing this inequality?
So that raises another question. In the news lately, actually last week or the week before, we heard about what happened to LeBron James at his home. We know that, well, that was just one thing that happened. There have been a series of things to happen. There was Bill Maher, who used the N-word on HBO. So how do you view things like that? Are those distractions? Are those things that we really should be focusing on? Or are those just things that are out there that we should maybe just say, those are just some crazies, let them go, and focus on some things that are more important? What do you think?
So to answer your question, I want to be very precise, because I don't want to get, when you say focus on, that's not saying you're not even looking at that at all, right? And so I would argue that, no, that's not things that we should be focused on. I think people who truly want to create an anti-racist America where racial disparities do not exist should be focused on searching out and studying the discriminatory policies that are actually creating those racial disparities. That should be our focus from a racial sense, right? We should be trying to eliminate racial inequality. We should be changing policy to make that happen. And we should not think that we have to do anything to black people to create equality. There's nothing wrong with black people. Really, the only thing that's wrong with black people is that we think something is wrong with black people. Just like the only thing that's extraordinary about white people is they think something is extraordinary about white people.
Okay, well. So, you've talked about Angela Davis, W.E.B. Du Bois, Thomas Jefferson, who we might consider, most of us probably consider, people who were probably, I don't know about Thomas Jefferson. I mean, we know that Thomas Jefferson has some issues. But the others, were probably some of the most pro-black people we know. Yet, you think they had some racist ideals?
So I think in the case of Du Bois in particular, I wanted to, first of all, you're mentioning, so Stand from the Beginning had 5 major characters, and sort of each of these characters sort of served as like tour guides or windows to this larger 3-way debate that I was referencing earlier. And Jefferson was one of those characters, Du Bois and Angela Davis was. In the case of Du Bois and even other people in the book, there's a specific reason why I wanted to write a history of racist ideas as opposed to racist with an S. I wanted to sort of show the complexity of the human mind, right? That in certain vantage points, you can see the racial groups as you could see a hierarchy, but in other vantage points, you can see the racial groups as equal. In certain ways, you could hold anti-racist ideas. In other ways, you could hold assimilationist ideas, as Du Bois did. And so I actually show in Stand from the Beginning that his heralded double consciousness was in fact a double consciousness of assimilationist and anti-racist ideas. But I also show over the course of his very long life that he was able to develop a single consciousness of anti-racism, particularly by the 1930s, in which he was critiquing his own ideas of earlier decades. And I sort of show that evolution in the text. So we're not static, right? You know, we can be born into a world and have assimilationist and anti-racist ideas, but I think the story of Du Bois shows that we have the capability to become anti-racist.
Okay. And with someone as talented as Du Bois, and it took an evolution
Yes.
for him to, to come to a realization. Boy, is there hope for just regular people like us? I mean, it seems like it's very complicated.
It is, and at the same time as it's complicated, it's actually simple. It's a very simple idea for a person to believe that the racial groups are equal. But then that becomes very complicated when you realize, all of these sort of different ways in which we have been told that they're not equal, that there's something wrong or inferior about black people. And so, what anti-racists do is, again, their assumption is equality between racial groups. That's their fundamental assumption. And then, therefore, when they see socioeconomic, when they see these disparities when it comes to, let's say, wealth, they don't say, okay, it must be because black people don't want to save money. No, they look for discrimination in basically banks giving out mortgages. And they find that discrimination, right? As many studies have found in recent years. And so I think that's really, and I'm actually working on a book right now entitled How to Be an Anti-Racist. And I'm taking the reader through my own sort of personal story. And I sort of begin the book with a chapter called My Racist Introduction. And I sort of take the reader through and how I sort of became an anti-racist in the way I tried to show that with Du Bois and Stand from the Beginning.
Listening to you talk about this, I also am thinking a lot about the young men and women that we come across all the time when we're reporting about the violence in Chicago. In neighborhoods where disinvestment is just a way of life. I mean, there's nothing there. It's obvious that the neighborhoods have been forgotten, and so have a lot of these young people, to be quite honest. So how do you make a young person who lives in that environment, who sees this every day, where the world tells him that he is not equal? How do you make him believe that he is?
Well, I think that's a very sort of difficult question. I think that it is a very long process. I think first and foremost, individuals, understand their world from their own very narrow vantage point, right? They don't know about that disinvestment. They don't know about the policies that are driving down the number of jobs in their community. They don't know about the policies driving down the amount of resources for their schools. They don't know about the policies causing police officers to continue to get off when they abuse them. They don't know about those things. All they know about is what they see. The violence, that they see. And so I think what I try to do with young people, just like I try to do with older people, is for them to step out of their own individual sort of circle and try to imagine their own circle from a sort of macro standpoint, which allows them to see how all of these greater forces are creating that circle, right? And I also try to sort of hit home that let's imagine for a moment that the problem is not the people. Let's just imagine for a moment that the problem is not the people. The problem is not these young black people in Southside Chicago. The problem is not their supposed horrible parents. Let's imagine that it's not the people. Then what else could be causing this? And those are the questions that I ask them, and sometimes they come up with brilliant answers.
And you're right. And I also think that young people who live in some of these very poor communities, it's their norm, right? It's who they identify with. And so it makes sense that there is often violence, right? I mean, do you also think that some of it is even a bit of self-hatred?
Yeah, I mean, I said the only thing wrong with black people is, we think something is wrong with black people. So there's certainly, that's the only thing that is well documented that's a problem with black people, is their own sense that they are a problem, right? Because they have been reared within that conception, and particularly poor black people, right? Because you have the entire weight of the nation, the intellectual weight of the nation, from black elites to non-blacks, looking at poor blacks as the worst problem in this country, as the cause of the violence, as the cause of their own poverty. And so for them, of course they're going to think, yes, I am the worst. I am at the bottom, right? I should be getting my head stepped over by every other group in this country. And so of course it's certainly internalized, even though those ideas are just not true, right? There is nothing wrong with poor black people, other than them thinking that there's something wrong with black people, poor black people. And if we were to look out at these people as human as us, I think it would make a world of difference.
And within the communities where this is happening, certainly young black men are killing other young black men who look just like them, who live just like them. That seems like the ultimate.
Yes. But I think another way for us to understand this is, for instance, if any of us were to go home today and pull up what are the top causes of death in this country, homicides is not even there, right? It's not even there, right? And so that's one of the reasons why, even though we'll demean these young black males, right? Are we demeaning all those white males who voted for Trump care, who presumably are going to cause way more deaths, right, if that bill is passed, than these young black males, right? So I think we have to think bigger, right? When we think of who is the most dangerous, who is killing Americans, right? It is not these young black males, right? When we imagine, why is it that so many Americans are obese? Why is it that so many Americans die of heart disease and cancer? Right? This isn't because of these young black males. And so I think, but again, we like to imagine, but there is, of course, there has not been a war against any of those people, any of those corporations, any of those fast food establishments that are causing those problems. You get me, I'm sorry.
No. One of the things that appears obvious is that if we're ever going to make a difference here, that it's going to be upon the people themselves to do it. A black president couldn't do it, right? It's no reason to think that we have an administration now that's going to do it. So it's on us, right? So where do we go from here? What do we do now?
So I think, again, as it relates to racial issues, I think another, I guess you can call it the central thesis of Stand From the Beginning, is for us to sort of rethink where racist ideas come from. And so we have been taught that people are just ignorant and hateful, and that's how they develop these racist ideas. And it's these people who had these ideas that black people are barbaric. These are the people who then instituted policies, racist policies like slavery, segregation, or even now mass incarceration. Well, I actually show that popular folktale is just that, a folktale. It's not true. What's actually has happened over the course of American history is that you've had people who have created discriminatory policies because it benefits them economically, politically, or even culturally, we can understand, I want to enslave people because it's going to make me what? Money, right? And then these very people, or their Sean Spicers, create, right? Create, produce, defend racist ideas to justify, to defend, to rationalize the inequality that comes out as a result of those policies, and then they circulate these racist ideas like there's voter fraud problem, right? And then people believe them and they become ignorant and hateful. And then it allows those policies to continue, and therefore those people to stay in office, those people to continue to make money, or those people to continue to benefit. Like, that's the history that I show. And so what that means is us trying to educate or persuade away the racist ideas of powerful Americans, it's bound to fail. What's actually led to change has been protesting against racist power, but even more importantly, gaining power and putting people who are committed to anti-racist policies in power and ensuring that those people are held accountable by the anti-racist common sense of you and I, of the people.
So that gives us a lot to think about. We're going to open it up for questions. People are lined up over here. Lots of questions I see. Okay.
Okay, testing, 1, 2, okay. As a woman, I've seen a lot of negative images of women. Certainly in the last election, Hillary was hated. A question I have as a white person is, why is there still a black acceptance in your communities on the N-word being okay only inside? I don't want to hear anyone say comments like dumb broad, woman driver, women in power are bitches. So why is that word still okay when all it does is reinforce the use of that word? The movie Fences was full of uses of that word. And in any community, that word should be gone. Why is that word still there? All it does for me is reinforce a bad word.
Okay, thank you.
So I should say that within the feminist community, there's actually a pretty strong debate going on about the V word. And so there are feminists who have sort of reimagined the B word as a sign of endearment. And of course, I'm sure you would disagree with that position. And I think within the black community, there's a similar debate sort of going on about the N-word, and that debate has been going on for quite some time. And I think what we should all do is we should engage in debates in our own communities. And so I think I'm not going to step into the women's community or the feminist community and state that, well, you should not be using the B word. And I think from the same standpoint, it's important for non-blacks to not step into the black community and tell us what we should or should not use. I think it's important, again, for us to try to stay in our own lanes.
I really appreciate your comments about the origins of racist ideas and how it makes money. And I wanted to point out a book that's written by Dorothy Roberts. I don't know if you're familiar with her. Wrote a book called Fatal Invention, which goes into the history of race and how race is mainly really a social construct that has been used to divide people. There's another book called The Harm and Hate Speech, which is also discusses the issue of free speech and when it really is free and when it isn't. I was concerned about some of the debate going on in some of these colleges now where you have people, give you an example. There's this guy, Charles Murray, who wrote The Bell Curve, along with a guy by the name of Richard Herrnstein, which basically came out with ideas around racists, blaming black people, especially for some of the ideas you mentioned. He actually was going to be speaking in Middlebury College recently, and then there was a protest that prevented him from speaking. Personally, I would like to know your opinion, because I actually think that that was a actually a good thing. Because the problem is, hate speech, I think, is something like yelling fire in a crowded theater. There are some laws against that. And in a racist society that creates the conditions that exist to build racism, to blame people, and as Charles Murray has done, for their own problem, for their own predicament, is to me dangerous and potentially harmful, and people die from that. So, you know, it's a tricky free speech thing, but thank you.
Very quickly, I'm happy you mentioned Dorothy Roberts' text, Fatal Inventions, one of my favorite books, and she actually operationalizes race as a political construct. And I think it's a very important distinction that this, again, is about power. It's really a power struggle. And as it relates to your question, I actually, a few years ago, I wrote a column that I'm sitting next to a world-class columnist. I almost feel bad saying that. I wrote a column that differentiated between free speech and unfree speech. And I made the case that unfree speech is based on a series of what we call now alternative facts or outright lies. And that people should not have the ability to stand up in a column or even in a speech and basically state a series of just lies that then people are going to believe, and then people are going to go out and kill people, as you certainly stated.
So, yeah, in talking about disinvestment in communities and different things, recently a Whole Foods opened in Inglewood, which is one of the severely, like, socially, economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, and there was some concern. There was concern from a bunch of groups, but inside of the community about the loss of income to locally owned businesses to this Whole Foods that brought better economic stability and jobs. Where does that fall in the spectrum of what your work is, and how can you walk the line between adding economic stability while not taking away other that exists?
Ooh, that's difficult. I think there's a difference between, I mentioned earlier about the importance of jobs. Even better than jobs is the ability to build wealth. And you build wealth through being able to own businesses. And specifically, working class and poor people, and even middle class people have to own small businesses. And so when you have a larger business like that come in, as you stated, it sort of reduces the market share for small businesses. However, at the same time, you have those companies coming and bringing a lot of jobs. So it's I think it's more of a question for that community themselves, right? For them to figure out what it is that they want. But I think if you were to remove the Whole Foods, I think it's just as important to bring in access to resources so those people can have access to capital to basically have not just small businesses, but small businesses that thrive.
Hi. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the impact of film and Hollywood experience impacting popular views on racist views, and speak a little bit about the legacy that we're still having a hangover from Birth of a Nation.
Yeah, so certainly, Birth of a Nation, the first major motion picture, was basically the best-selling film until another film by the name of Gone with the Wind came out. And Gone with the Wind held it down until another film I talk about, until other films sort of emerged. And so I think you had a generation of people that were born and raised thinking that the Reconstruction era was horrible for white people. Or you have people thinking that black people just loved slavery and loved to sort of, through Gone with the Wind. And just like now, you have people who still were born and raised on Tarzan films. So they think that Africa is this sort of barbaric place. So when I go to Africa, they're like, are you gonna wear clothes over there? Crazy things like that, right? And so I think it's certainly, people watch films even more so than they read books. And so I think that's why there's all sorts of racist ideas that these films are reinforcing, that of course we have to push back against.
So, Ibram, you have given us so much to think about, and I certainly appreciate that. So, let's go home and do some self-evaluation. I know I am. Okay.
All right, thank you once again to Darlene Glanton and Ibram Kendi. Mr. Kendi will be signing books out in the back, and there'll also be books for sale. Thank you very much.
And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. This is our live coverage from the 33rd Annual Printers Row Lit Fest in Chicago. And you've just been listening to Ibram Kendi, winner of last year's National Book Award. Now in just a few minutes, we'll be back live with Michael Eric Dyson. His latest book is Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America.
Well, late August, really. So I'll, sorry, the books, bro. I just got on that red house and going north. Have you ever done this? Because I went 3,400 to 7,000 on Amazon. You know what I'm saying? See, I know you would know. I know you would know. Hey, 3,400 to 7,000 on Amazon. That's pretty good. Yeah, that's kind of good. Yeah, I'm on that. They're gonna replay the thing. Like very good. So, but I'll reach out to you, and then my class is on Monday. Yeah, I don't know if you got free on Monday. So seminar. All right, bro. All right, man. Let's get a picture. Let's get a picture right there. I know you did. You know that piece, man.
Oh, I should have bought.
Can you take a picture of us? Can you snap a picture of us?
Yes, sir. What you do up there?
All right. You gotta do it. The one, no. Yeah, this one right there. Maybe somebody.
That's the one. Yeah, I'm not.
Right. Okay. All right. I'll get somebody. I'll get somebody.
So both of you. And this is a project from Chicago, on Chicago
We're always here. Another one shows up. Oh.
Yeah. And then one with mine too.
Yeah.
Let me get some of that National Book Award. Killing times, man. You killing the game, bro. I'm so proud of you. I said, man, I saw that brother. What, down in Florida? Down in Florida? I said, that guy was, I knew he was special. Come on.
Thank you so much.
Yep. So when we get to DC, we'll hang out. All right.
Nice to meet you.
God bless you, baby. Take good care of that.
Oh, yeah, they're waiting. Your public is waiting. Oh, you following him? Go ahead. Thank you. Thank you.
Maybe is he still hanging out on the stage? Yeah, he's still out. Okay.
Hi, I'm Jen White. Nice to meet you. I love your session.
How to handle the session.
Hi,
Enjoy your question.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, she kept me on my toes.
Yeah, she did a great job.
Okay.
So you just lay it on.
Yeah, why don't we bring it down?
Whenever you want, you want to write hugs and kisses on it out. Who knows? That's what up to you and me. Okay. Would you like yours personal one? Yes. So, whatever you write. Did you write? Did you need a pen?
Thank you. Okay. That's the blood sugar.
I didn't know I Well, for example, choose sky.
Especially with the parents, too.
Okay, look, roll it down.
It's probably in my classroom. I work with young men that are incarcerated.
Hi. Hi, I'm fine. Sunday, Trinity United Church of Christ. That's okay, you can stay on. Maybe you should come 7:30, 11, because the Pastor Moss and I, we keep up with what we're doing. So this is one of our collections.
Oh, wow.
You didn't even know you were coming. Colony and Nation is next. Thank you so much. God bless you.
Professor, congratulations on your work. Thank you for your talk. I mean, I'm one of those naive white people that my black colleagues told me right away, Steve, you're way too naive to think that.
Affordable Care Act.
No, you don't have to do that. No, I'm sorry.
This Affordable Care Act reduced more black and Latino uninsured
By the way, Trump cares, man. Thanks a lot.
I kicked him out of Iowa. I was a student at the University of Iowa. He went on to write the bell curve. I haven't read the whole book yet, but I'm going to get there. But it's recycling. It's making money. Thanks. Pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure to hear you speak. Thank you for coming.
Right now, I just
Well,